And oh, what the fuck? This thing fucking froze. All right, well, what is it? Day 75 of this bitch. Nobody knows for sure. No one knows for sure. No one really knows for sure. Elu ve elu divrei Elohim chaim. But this is the Missouri we live by. West side. Yeah, rabbits in the back. Yeah, why do you say west side? Okay, so when I was a kid, I was around all boys, and occasionally there'd be like minor tussles, never anything super serious, ever. Like nobody was getting punches in the face or anything, but you might wrestle, and and there's like the east side and the west side. There's the north side, the south side. There are all the differences. There's the northwest side, the near northwest side. There are all kinds of places. Anyway, I would come to learn that the people from the west side, we were the suburbs, but really, yeah, but we'd spend some time on the west side. Really, you ever live there? Um, Not like permanently, but I never live anywhere permanently, baby. Anyway, we'd be chilling, and there might be a tussle that occurred, and like kids just like jumping in, and some of the kids would yell "West Side" when this tussle would occur, and that meant like, "Hey, I want backup," and anybody from the West Side get in on this bitch. Really, that's where West Side comes from. Really, so that's why you throw gang signs around like constantly because of this behavior that you observed. Absolutely, in the West Side, LA is tighter than the East Side. East Side's cool too, though. Really? Yeah, it's very kitschy. Uh, it's cool. It's very, I don't know, like Cesar Chavez Boulevard used to be Brooklyn Boulevard, like Boyle Heights, like it was a Jewish neighborhood, all kinds of shit. Anyway, is that the end of your fucking story? Yeah, are we gonna read through all the shit? No, we're watching fucking documentaries. Why? Because I'm sick of that other shit. Really, it's just the same fucking shit every day, and we'll get it. I thought about doing it today, but all right. Are you done? What do you think of your robots? I'm very proud of them. YouTube. All right, everybody. No, no, this shit is really long. I like how they have videos and short videos. How about long videos, motherfucker? Really? Dog. This is shit. Okay. So we watched a stupid one. All right. Are you gonna show it on the TV?
Now that we've explored both Sufism, which is often referred to as Islamic mysticism,
No.
and Christian mysticism extensively, I suppose
put it
it's
there.
natural that we should
You figure it out.
third of the major Abrahamic religions, Judaism, and explore its mystical tradition. Needless to say, there's a whole lot to explore there, and it's a daunting undertaking. Now, when most people think of Jewish mysticism, they will automatically think, well, Kabbalah. And Kabbalah is indeed an important part of the story and will show up later on, but that's precisely the point. It is a part of
Somebody'd be like, "I'm good with this view. Calm down, woman."
simply equate the terms Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism. Things are more complicated than that. Kabbalah can be seen as a certain kind of Jewish mysticism, but there are other expressions and types within this one category across history. So, what is this general category
Big
of
too
Jewish
young.
mysticism? And how can we understand its history and characteristics? That is precisely what we're going to talk about in this episode. This video is a kind of collaboration with two of my dear colleagues and friends, Justin Sledge and Zevi Sloan from Seekers of Unity and Esoterica, respectively. I'm doing this together with them, not in the usual way of us doing separate videos, but they will both be showing up in this video to tackle topics that they are particularly well versed in, to really give you a proper introduction to some of these very complex aspects of Jewish mysticism. So what do we mean when we say Jewish mysticism? I don't know if you have to define the term Jewish or Judaism here, so what about the second term? We've discussed the term mysticism, its problems and possible definitions in the last episode of Christianity, where we pointed out that the term often denotes experiences of, reactions to, and preparations for union with God. I think that video we settled on a more nuanced and careful working definition based on Rabbi Rothschild, who said that it is, in the Christian context, the most important belief and practices that concerns the preparation for, or consciousness of, and the reaction to what can be described as the immediate or direct presence of God. We might generalize that even more by adding there is a direct encounter with the presence of the absolute, which is often equated with God or religion in this traditions and context. But mysticism and Jewish mysticism is more than that too. It's a whole tendency within Judaism that includes certain features and characteristics. A leading scholar of Jewish mysticism, Rabbi Rothschild, puts it really well when he says, quote, "It is possible to isolate two distinct concerns running through all the major texts that scholars include in the corpus of Jewish mysticism. On the one hand, there is the claim to esoteric knowledge, whose content will naturally vary from one person to another. It is not readily available to the masses through the more common avenues of religious worship.
Yo, this is a test.
The second main element identified in the Jewish mystical literature is the emphasis placed on intense religious experience. A particular form of this experience varies, but it usually includes often the following: ascent, vision of the divine form, angelification, or mystical union. The word mysticism was used here to refer to those trends of thought in Judaism that were according to either esoteric knowledge of the God of philosophy or to an intense religious experience or a visionary or intuitive sort of ecstasy. However, these two terms were separated from Jewish mysticism. This point should be kept in mind as we move through the episode. The fact that we live on this mysticism can be found all over the history of Judaism expressing itself in different ways and different forms, but arguably always being there in some way or another. As early as we can possibly go into the days of the Israelite biblical prophets, clear indications that the great prophetic experience itself is a separate mystery. Like the education of the village center in Jerusalem, several prophets that appear from time to time to the great messages of God, often involving pieces of Israel. These prophets seem to have been very powerful experiences experiences as part of the creative process, which can even be induced by things like music and dancing. This becomes even more apparent in the video shows like recent commodities that conceives of a creative process that is decidedly impressive. The producer gradually reflects his intellectual faculty and skills until it is so perfect and receives a overflow of revelation from God directly into it. This answer goes, no, in true reality, the prophecy consists in being able to flow only flowing from God. Many are challenged through the intermediation of the active intellect toward the rational faculty in the first place and thereafter towards the imaginative faculty. This is the highest degree of man and the ultimate term of perfection that can exist for the species, and this state is the ultimate term of perfection for the imaginative faculty. The mysticism of biblical prophecy is perhaps most clear and striking in one particular account, the famous vision of Ezekiel. In the very opening to the book of Ezekiel in the Bible, we are presented with a positively shocking, almost psychedelic experience where the prophet has a vision of a throne chariot of God, surrounded by fire and strange, frightening creatures with several heads, wheels inside wheels covered with eyes. It's an absolutely mind-blowing account of a direct encounter with God that can certainly be called mystical, and will continue to give important inspiration for later expressions of mysticism too. Moving just a little bit ahead of history, I also should mention that the picture and intellectual movement of trees, also called apocalypticism, which focuses on long-lasting features not only of Judaism but also of Christianity. One particular account of the famous vision of Ezekiel. In the very opening to the book of Ezekiel in the Bible, we are presented with a positively shocking, almost psychedelic experience that the prophet has a vision of a throne chariot of God, surrounded by fire and strange, frightening creatures with seven heads, wheels inside wheels. Original faculty in the first place, and thereafter towards the imaginative faculty. This is the highest degree of man, the ultimate term of perfection that can exist for the species, and this state is the ultimate term of perfection for the imaginative faculty. The mysticism of biblical prophecy is perhaps most clear and striking in one particular account, the famous vision of Ezekiel. In the very opening to the book of Ezekiel of the Bible, we are presented with a positively shocking, almost psychedelic experience where the prophet has a vision of a throne chariot of God, surrounded by fire and strange, frightening creatures with seven heads, wheels inside wheels covered with eyes. It's an absolutely mind-bending account of a direct encounter with the divine that can certainly be called mystical, and will continue to give important inspiration for later expressions of mysticism too. Moving just a little bit ahead of history, we also should mention the intellectual and intellectual movement of Judaism, also called apocalypticism, which gave us some of the most long-lasting features not only of Judaism but also Christianity and Islam. In this literature, there are certainly mystical elements, such as the books of Enoch, which describes how the titular character descends on account of heaven during a tree, taken up by God, and eventually be transformed into the image of God, making some of the earliest examples of the secular church, which we saw in mysticism. And in the earliest forms of Jewish philosophy, we also find features that many conservatives consider as mystical. The early important and fascinating fire of Alexandria, a complete conceptual philosopher often identified with esoteric and century philosophy, introduced many ideas that really represent the history of mysticism. Despite being Jewish, it would become more influential argument in Christianity, but his impact in Jewish thought is not mysticism. For example, he talks about the fact that he had mystical experiences of a vision of God and an interviewing with God and answering his perhaps the first kind of mystical movement that we want to use in this period was a movement that occurs in the first few centuries AD, so just after the fall of the second temple, and it's the period, of course, when Judaism is developed as a new structure. And this is a kind of mysticism that is often referred to as Merkava and Kofanot mysticism, which means chariots and palaces, respectively. This is a really, really fascinating fledged sort of channel to see
Since the early modern period, Jewish mysticism has basically surrounded with the Kabbalah, speculative theosophy centered around the divine dynamism of the spirit of the divine creation. However, for nearly 800 years prior to the rise of the Kabbalah, it appears that the mystical association known as Merkaba, Chariot, Taoist mysticism was the primary mysticism, perhaps from the early period of the destruction of the Second Temple, maybe even back earlier, like the Prophet Ezekiel, until the rise of the Kabbalah in the 18th century. So, what was Merkaba or Chariot mysticism? I'm Dr. Justin Stokes for the ViralRabbi. Merkaba mysticism is the journey into the divine realm, where witness presence of God entered into Ezekiel chapter 1 and Isaiah chapter 6. There, the prophets made a mystical journey to the divine throne room, where in Ezekiel's vision, at least, God's throne is imagined as kind of a chariot carried with God's angelic beings. God is open hypothetical by the angelic beings, and in Isaiah the prophet is given a vision of the divine worship, the glory of God by the seraphim, the angelic beings. Scholars debate whether the rosemary was purely literary or the result of actual mystical phenomenology. I suspect a lot of it.
Oh, this is a long one.
And directly related to that of those specific priest prophets or representative of a larger sense aspect of the mystical tradition. Frankly, we're never going to know. However, with the rise of the topic, Judaism, indeed, and following Babylonian exile, numerous, a veritable wide array of texts were proposed detailing its journeys into the cosmos and into the divine realms. And some of those texts, these journeys fulfilling this transformation, help them program into angelic beings themselves after performing or even sitting on the divine realm. The most famous of these texts is Enoch. Even earlier in the days, Jesus made mental break from Christianity. The Apostle Paul trained himself into the secondary life that had been taken up into the flow of heaven and into the vision of divine glory as nothing less than the resurrection of Jesus Christ, Messiah. Further, early such mystical visions were also reported among the new generation of rabbis, those known as in those narratives, told us four rabbis on the journey of the mystical darkness and heaven. However, the journey is long. There are illusion tests to test their worthiness to the divine realms, and all but some of these rabbis failed the test. One becoming insane, one dying, and one becoming a heretic after Metatron sitting on the throne of God. Only
now that we've explored both Sufism, which is often referred to as Islamic mysticism, and Christian mysticism extensively, I suppose it's only natural that we should move on to the third of the major Abrahamic religions, Judaism, and explore its mystical tradition. Needless to say, there's a whole lot to explore here, and it's a daunting undertaking. Now, when most people think of Jewish mysticism, they will automatically think Kabbalah. And Kabbalah is indeed an important part of this story, and will show up later on as precisely the fact. It is a part of this story. But many simply equate the text Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism, things are more complicated. Kabbalah is necessarily beyond the Jewish mysticism. There are other expressions and types within this broader category of this history. So, what is this wider general category of Jewish mysticism, and how can we understand its history and characteristics? That is precisely what we're going to talk about in this episode.
What day is it? 22nd of Adar, 5786, Wednesday, March 11th, 2026.
This video is a kind of collaboration with two of my dear colleagues and friends, Justin Sloan knowledge and Zevi Slavin from Secret Security and Esoterica, respectively, the other way around, not messed up. I'm doing this together with them, not the usual way of us doing separate videos, but they will both be shown up in this video to tackle topics that they to well versed in, to really give you a proper introduction to some of these very complex aspects of Jewish mysticism. So what do we mean when we say Jewish mysticism? I don't really think we have to define Jewish or Judaism. So what about the second term? We discussed the term mysticism, its problems and possible definitions in the last episode of Christianity, where we pointed out that the term often connotes experience of reactions to revelations for God. In that video, we set a lot of nuanced and careful working definition based on the Rabbi who said that it is in the Christian context at least holds belief and practices that concerns that revelation for, the consciousness of, and the reaction to what can be described as the immediate or direct presence of God. We might generalize that even more by adding that it is a direct encounter with the presence of the absolute words of God, which is often greater traditions and context. But mysticism and Jewish mysticism is more than that too. It's a whole tendency within Judaism that includes certain features and characteristics. A leading scholar of Jewish mysticism, Rabbi Rothschild, puts it really well when he says, quote, "It is possible to isolate two distinct concerns running through all the major texts that scholars include in the corpus of Jewish mysticism. On the one hand, there is the claim to esoteric knowledge, whose content will naturally vary from one person to another, that is not readily available to the masses through the more common avenues of religious worship and ritual understanding. The second major element identifiable in Jewish mystical literature is the emphasis placed on intense religious experience. The particular form of this experience varies, but it usually includes one of the following: heavenly descent, vision of divine form, angelification, or mystical dream. The word mysticism will be used here to refer to those trends of thought in Judaism that lay claim to either esoteric knowledge of the God of philosophy, or to an intense religious experience of a visionary or dramatic sort, ecstasy. Though I do not think these two can always be separated or clearly distinguished. These points should be kept in mind as we move through their discussion. In fact, with all this in mind, mysticism can be found all over the history of Judaism in different ways, expressing itself in different ways and taking different forms, but arguably always being there in some way or another. As early as we can possibly go into the days of the Israelite biblical prophets, we have clear indications that the very prophetic experience itself is something mystical. In ancient Israel, with its called center of Jerusalem, there were, as we all know, several prophets that appeared from time to time to relay messages from God, often involving criticisms of the way the Israelites lived their worship. And these prophets seem to have had very powerful experiences as part of the revelatory process, which can even be induced by things like music and dancing. This becomes even more apparent in the later medieval Jewish thinkers such as Maimonides, who conceives of a theory of prophecy that is decidedly mystical. The person gradually perfects his intellectual faculty and spirit until it is so perfect that he receives an overflow of revelation from God directly into the intellect. He says, quote, "Know that the true reality and validity of prophecy consists in its being an overflowing from God, being recharged in God, through the intermediation of the active intellect toward the rational faculty in the first place, and thereafter towards the imaginative faculty. This is the highest degree of man and the ultimate term of perfection that can exist for the species, and this state is the ultimate term of perfection for the imaginative faculty." The mysticism of biblical prophecy is perhaps most clear and striking in one particular account, the famous vision of Ezekiel. In the very opening to the book of Ezekiel in the Hebrew Bible, we are presented with a positively shocking and almost psychedelic experience where the prophet has a vision of a thrown chariot of God, surrounded by fire and strange, frightening creatures with several heads, wheels inside wheels covered with eyes. It's an absolute mind-bending account of a direct encounter with the divine and can certainly be called mystical, and would continue to be an important inspiration for later expressions of ultimate term of perfection for the imaginative faculty. The mysticism of biblical prophecy is perhaps most clear and striking in one particular account, the famous vision of Ezekiel. In the very opening to the book of Ezekiel in the Hebrew Bible, represented a positively shocking, almost psychedelic experience when the prophet has a vision of a thrown chariot of God, surrounded by fire and strange, frightening creatures with several heads, wheels inside wheels covered with eyes. It's an absolutely mind-bending account of a direct encounter with the divine that can certainly be called mystical and would continue to be an important inspiration for later expressions of mysticism too. Moving just a little bit ahead of history, we also should mention the literature and intellectual movement of Judaism, often called apocalypticism, which give us some of the most long-lasting features not only of pagan Judaism but also of Christianity and Islam. In this literature, there are certainly mystical elements, such as in the books of Enoch, which describes how a titular character ascends on a kind of heavenly journey and taken up by God, and eventually be transformed into the internet, making it some of the earliest examples of ascent literature, which is so important to mysticism, of course. And in the earliest forms of Jewish philosophy, we also find features that many would certainly conceive as mystical. The ever-important and fascinating Philo of Alexandria, a Middle-Platonist Jewish philosopher who often read the Bible esoterically according to Platonic philosophy, introduced many ideas that would be recurring in the history of mysticism. Despite being Jewish, he would become more influential arguably in Christianity, but his impact in Jewish thought has not been significant. For example, he talks about the fact that a human being can have mystical experiences of the vision of God, and even achieve union with God or an aspect of God. I think that we will definitely return to. Perhaps the first kind of mystical movement within Judaism, especially after the prophetic period, is a movement that appears in the first few centuries AD, so just after the fall of the Second Temple. And it's the period, of course, when rabbinic Judaism as we know it really started to develop. And this is a kind of mysticism that is often referred to as Merkabah and Hecharet mysticism, which means chariots and palaces, respectively. This is a really, really fascinating type of mysticism that often involves ascent, or rather descent, as we say, and visions of this chariot throne of God, which is, of course, as you probably guessed, directly related to this vision of Ezekiel that we mentioned earlier. To give you an overview of this incredible kind of early Jewish mysticism, here is Dr. Justin Sledge from the channel Esoteric Entertainment.
Since the early modern period, Jewish mysticism has become basically synonymous with the Kabbalah, a speculative theosophy centered around the divine dynamism of the spirit or divine emanations. However, for nearly 800 years prior to the rise of the Kabbalah, it appears that the mystical ascent literature known as Merkava, chariot, Hechalet, or palace mysticism was the primary form of Jewish mysticism, perhaps from roughly the period of the destruction of the Second Temple, maybe even back earlier, back to Ezekiel, until the rise of the Kabbalah in the 15th century. So, what was Merkabah, or chariot mysticism? I'm Dr. Justin Sledge from the channel Esoterica. Merkava mysticism takes as its central aim a journey into the divine realm to ultimately bear witness to the presence of God, anchored in the visions of Ezekiel chapter 1 and Isaiah chapter 6. There, the prophets make the mystical journey to the divine throne room, where, in Ezekiel's vision at least, God's throne is imagined as a kind of chariot composed of quasi-angelic beings, positively psychedelic quasi-angelic beings, and in Isaiah the prophet is given a vision of the divine worship, glory of God by the seraphim, angelic beings of fire. Scholars debate to what degree those narratives are purely literary or the result of actual mystical phenomenology. I suspect the latter just as much as the former. And to what degree those experiences were either syncretic to those specific prophets or representative of a larger priestly/prophetic mystical tradition. Frankly, we never know. However, with the rise of apocalyptic Judaism easing and following Babylonian exile, numerous, a veritable library of texts were composed detailing mystical journeys through the cosmos and into divine realms. In some of those texts, these journeys culminate with a transformation of the pilgrim into angelic beings themselves after beholding or even sitting on the divine throne. The most famous of these texts being the three books of Enoch. Even early in the days of Jesus' movement of the kind of Christianity, the Apostle Paul claims himself in the book of 2 Corinthians to have been taken up into the third heaven and given a vision of the divine glory as nothing less than the resurrected Jesus Christ as Messiah. Further, early such mystical visions were also reported among the generation of the rabbis, those known as the Tanaim, the kind of compositors of the Mishnah. And those narratives were told of four rabbis who journeyed to the mystical garden of heaven. However, the journey is fraught with peril. There are illusion tests to test their worthiness to enter the divine realm, and all but one of these rabbis failed the test, one becoming insane, one dying, and one becoming a heretic, fulfilling the angel Metatron sitting on the throne of God. Only the Rabbi Akiva descends and ascends in peace. Elsewhere in the Talmud literature, there are even very strict prohibitions on talking about these topics, to the point where it says it's better not to even be born or to publicly speak on these topics. While scholars aren't quite sure how, it does appear that in para-rabbinic circles of this period and later, there emerged a school of mystic descent. They usually refer to themselves as Yordei Merkava, descenders to the chariot, wherein certain rabbinical heroes, typically Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmael, make their way through the palaces or pesalot of the heavenly realms. They bypass terrifying angelic guardians with quasi-magical codes and symbols to eventually enter nothing less than the throne room of God, sometimes being personally transformed into beings of fire, a bit like angels, and or joining in the divine service with the seraphim, the divine Avodah, the worship of God. What has survived down to us from this form of mysticism is basically a small library of Merkabah literature composed over several centuries with mystical narratives of these journeys, magical codes that are used to bypass these fierce angelic guardians of the divine realms. In this literature, the angels are much more like cosmic marines, frankly, and the ecstatic hymns and songs offered in those heavenly palaces, some of which have actually made their way down to this day in Jewish literature. A particularly shocking text in this literature is the Shir Komai, or the measure of disasters, wherein the physical dimensions of God's body, measured in unit of Persian unit called the parasine, along with the secret names of the literal body of God, are given. Scholars have even argued that the rationalism of Maimonides' theology may very well be a kind of indirect assault on this very type of divine mystical anthropomorphism, otherwise in Judaism. Sadly, we know very little, basically nothing about how this mysticism was performed. The only sustained discussion, I mean by sustained, I mean a couple of sentences, is mentioned by the Haggadah at the turn of the first millennium of the Common Era. He writes, "You may perhaps know that many of the sages hold that when a man is worthy and blessed with certain qualities, and he wishes to gaze at the heavenly chariot and the halls that the fellow angels are high, he must follow certain exercises. He must fast for a number of days, he must place his head between his knees, and he must whisper incantations to himself, certain praises of God with his face toward the ground. As a result, he will gaze into his innermost recesses of his own heart, and it will seem as if he saw the seven halls with his own eyes, moving from hall to hall, to observe that which is found therein. Another related text, the Torah literature, in which an angel is actually summoned down from heaven to teach rapidly the secrets of the Torah to these rabbinical figures, includes even stricter imposition of ritual piety, fasting, study, and prayer, training athletic spiritual asceticism. It's very likely that these techniques vary from teacher to teacher and were primarily transmitted orally, but seem to have been able to induce a kind of trance-like hallucinatory state wherein one traveled down, descended into the chariot. Thus, the Merkava literature, including the Shir Kama and the Torah literature, constitute a form of Jewish mysticism that endured for centuries, maybe even over a millennium. These mystical texts and traditions are found throughout the ancient Jewish world and at times resemble the magical practices similar to those found in the Greek magic of the papyri and the various mystical forms of ascent in literature found among the Gnostics and in those of the Hermetic schools of philosophical spirituality. The Merkava literature and perhaps its practice would also eventually make its way into Central Europe among the German pietists in the early Middle Ages, a center of Jewish medieval occultism more generally. However, with the development of philosophical speculation around the divine emanations of the spheroids in Spain, France in the 12th and 13th centuries, Merkava mysticism in general would come to be assimilated into the emergent school of Kabbalah. Indeed, that text can also be found in the foundational text of the Kabbalah of the Radiance or the Sacred Zohar. This was something like a new period in the history of Jewish mysticism and an evolution of Jewish mysticism of ascent to the divine. However, the Merkava and El Adam continues to survive in the weekend Jewish liturgy and is one of the many instances of profound mystical esotericism making its way into the everyday world of the prayer life of Judaism. If you're interested in learning more about Merkava mysticism or actually reading some of the texts of this tradition, there is several scholarly book recommendations over in the description, though I have to warn you, with much academic publishing comes much expense. These books are not cheap, unfortunately. And if you're interested in learning more about esotericism, both Jewish and non-Jewish esotericism, check out my channel, Esoterica. Now, back to my colleague and dear friend.
Thank you so much, Justin. And for anyone who's interested, Justin's channel, Esoterica, is truly a gem of religious studies, YouTube, and philosophy. It's just amazing in so many ways. So check out that channel, especially if you're interested in talking to esotericism and cults. This fascinating work about Hasidic mysticism was very prominent and popular during the first millennium AD. It was practiced by rabbis and prominent figures of Judaism at the time, and was essentially the main form of Jewish mysticism for most of history until the birth of Kabbalah in the 13th century. With that said, Jewish mysticism was much more complex than this too, and there were many different mystical movements and developments during the first millennium. Among them were the compositional books that would become fundamental for the development of Kabbalah. The most important of these are probably the Sefer Yetzirah and the Sefer Habaim. The Sefer Yetzirah, or Book of Creation, is an absolutely baffling book. It's quite famous around the world and has shown up in pop culture, like in an episode of The X-Files, and usually in connection to stories about the Golden Age. What this book actually is, as the title suggests, is an exploration of how God created the world through the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet and a mysterious concept which it calls the Sfirot B'Yamah. You may recognize this concept as the Sfirot will become perhaps the most central part of Kabbalah thereon, representing the emanations of God. In the Sefer Yetzirah, however, which came out long before works like the Zohar, it's highly unclear what the Sfirot B'Yamah actually is supposed to be, other than that they're a 10. Scholars really disagree, and there's no consensus on the details of the system, although some argue that the author of the Sefer Yetzirah was influenced by Neo-Pythagoreanism, and that these Sefirot are some kind of mathematical geometric concepts that is central to reality. Whatever the case, this work explores how God uses these Sefirot, along with the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, combining them to create the world. Thus establishing that the core most lasting themes in Jewish mysticism, albeit in primitive form, namely the Sefirot, at least in name, and the importance of the Hebrew letters and the mystical powers. As for who wrote the book and when, the scholars are just as perplexed as he too. There have been some suggestions that it was probably written during the Talmudic period, so maybe around the year 500, give or take a few centuries. It really is a baffling text that we know surprisingly little about, given how important it has been for the history of Jewish mysticism and just Judaism in general. It's a truly fascinating and very significant and important mystical text. The second book, the Sefer HaBahir, the Illumination, is equally important, if not even more in some ways. It is also highly uncertain and debated authorship, and was probably composed sometime in the 9th century AD or perhaps slightly earlier. With that said, there have been various and widely different claims, some Jewish traditions dating it to the 1st century AD, but other academics dating it to as late as the 13th century. So, needless to say, it's an open question. In any case, this book is significant for various reasons, among them because many consider it the first proper work of what would become Kabbalah. And to be clear, Kabbalah as we know it didn't exist yet at this time. But in the Sefer HaBahir, we see some of the key concepts and claims of Kabbalah formulated for the first time. Essentially, the book is a kind of midrashic commentary on the Bible, particularly on the book of Genesis and creation. And what's so significant about this book is that it takes many elements of mystical literature and philosophical speculation at the time and sort of combines it. So, for example, it takes this idea from the Sefer Yetzirah of the Sefirot going up, and also sort of combines that with philosophical speculation, probably Neo-Platonic origin, about the relationship between the infinite God, the absolute, and creation, to create a kind of synthesis between these two, where this relationship is explained in some way through these Sefirot. So in the Sefer HaBahir, the way that God, the infinite, creates the finite world is through emanations and stages, going from the absolute, infinite, apophatic divine all the way down to the world. And these energies or stages of God's emanation are the Sefirot. In other words, here, the Sefirot take on the form that we are of, and we'll go into further details about this system. So, in this environment, we see a diversity of different kinds of Jewish mysticism. Some kinds that are very particular and prominent at the time, such as Rabbi mysticism, but also the earliest whisperings of things to come. Rabbi Kaplan, who has written a popular translation of the work, says about it, quote, until the publication of the Zohar, the Bahir was the most influential and widely quoted primary source of Calvinistic teachings. It is quoted in virtually every major book on Kabbalah, and it is cited numerous times by Rabbi Rothschild in his commentary on the Torah. It is also paraphrased and quoted many times in the Zohar. And it is indeed at this point, well into the Middle Ages, when some significant things really start to happen. Particularly in southwestern Europe, in southern France and Spain, we see over the course of the 12th through 13th century the development of what would become widely known as Kabbalah, later essentially becoming synonymous with Jewish mysticism. Now, we must be clear right from the start that there isn't a Kabbalah, rather many different kinds of Kabbalah, even in this early period. This was a highly active and flourishing intellectual environment. Spain had been a place where Jews, Muslims, and Christians had lived together for centuries under Islam. And while this situation, of course, wasn't without its conflicts and tensions, it had been a time and place of unusual levels of cross-pollination and inspiration across religious lines. Philosophers like Ibn Rajah, Tafayl and Ibn Rushd on the Muslim side worked alongside Jewish thinkers and inspired many of them, such as the massively important Maimonides and the Jewish side. Furthermore, Sufism, often called Islamic mysticism, had also become quite popular and widespread in the region, and already by the 12th century, we see Jewish writers clearly being influenced by Sufi piety and practice, such as Bahir ibn Qudas al-Hidayah ila Fara'id al-Qulub, the duties of the heart, a book essentially of ethics and spiritual reflections. In other words, this was a very vibrant time with a lot of intellectual debate on various sides. Maimonides and his rationalistic writings, which interpreted Jewish scripture and religion according to philosophical Aristotelian principles, became very controversial, and there was a kind of division, although we should overemphasize this dichotomy necessarily, between pro-Maimonidean rationalists and anti-Maimonideans. What was the place of reason and philosophy in Jewish life? These topics are quite complicated, and the categories between reason and mysticism are really complicated. Many have even claimed that Maimonides himself, the arch rationalist, had a mystical side to him. My friend Sebi from the channel Seekers of Unity has been a whole series on the topic of Maimonides' mysticism or not mysticism. That's the question, right? So if you're interested in that topic, then go check out those wonderful videos. Whatever the case, it is in this vibrant environment that Kabbalah is born. Of course, most likely as a result of this chaotic and really just very eventful intellectual and mystical life. Many would say even that Kabbalah kind of emerges as a response to Maimonidean rationalism, as a way of sort of saying, identifying themselves as the opposite of that. We are not Maimonideans, so that instead we present this other way of interpreting Judaism, which becomes Kabbalah. And while there might be some truth to this, certainly I think a lot of Kabbalah is in response to what was seen as the extreme rationalism, the radical rationalism of some of the Maimonides. We should be careful about making too simplistic claims about such things. This dichotomy between Kabbalah or mysticism and philosophy doesn't always hold. And one very good example of why that is a single man, and that is Abraham of Rabbi. But before we jump into the details of Kabbalah and others like him, what is Kabbalah to begin with? Well, as you've hopefully picked up on this point, it isn't a single thing, but several schools of thought and practice, usually connected by certain key features, but often also very distinct from each other. The word Kabbalah essentially means something received, and it's often therefore translated as tradition. Indeed, the Kabbalists themselves view their tradition as one that stretches back to the Bible itself, a kind of esoteric dimension of the Jewish religion that is restricted to certain kinds of people. A common idea in Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism, as it is in some other traditions, is that there are different levels or dimensions to Scripture. In Scripture, such as the Bible, they say one thing on the surface, but there's a whole portion of meaning hiding beneath the plain words. Indeed, it is common within Judaism, and Kabbalah particularly, to divide biblical reading into four levels: literal, surface level, elusive, allegorical, and lastly, the mystical level. And although Kabbalistic reading of Scripture is often very literal, almost hyper-literal, it can be said that they sometimes, through this hyper-literalism actually, are concerned with these hidden mystical dimensions of what is said in Scripture and preserved in the Jewish tradition as a whole. There are specific techniques of discovering these true meanings, and often spiritual practices aimed at things like purifying the soul, the intellect, and approaching or interacting with the divine life. But what this means at a more specific level can differ depending on which school of Kabbalah we're talking about. And to return then to our narrative, the 13th century mystic philosopher Abraham of Rabbi is one of the earliest Kabbalists who developed a kind of system and practice that is very different from the Kabbalah that most people know. By combining the rationalist philosophy of Maimonides with the mystical teachings found in books like the Sefer Yetzirah and probably other sources, including probably Sufism and the ascetic Ashkenazi Hasidism in Europe in that time, he started something that has come to be known as either prophetic Kabbalah or ecstatic Kabbalah. Not only made a full episode on Abulafa and his teachings, which honestly is probably one of my favorite videos that I've made. Abulafa is just such an incredibly fascinating figure, so go check out that episode if you're interested. But as a shorter overview, Abulafa's Kabbalah is one that is primarily focused on what we could call different kinds of meditative practice, and the employment and speculation about the mystical powers of the Hebrew letters. Abulafa describes different, often complex forms of meditation, which often include vocalizing Hebrew words and letters, moving the head in certain ways, and other involved techniques, with the aim of thus having a mystical experience in different stages once intellect becomes somehow separated from the body until one reaches the ultimate goal of the path, which is known as David Quotes, concluding to God. Where one is united with the active intellect and ultimately, at least according to some interpretations, united with God himself. Abulafa says, quote, the ultimate composite, which is man, comprises all the spheres and whose intellect is the active intellect, and when you will untie its knots, you will be united with it in a unique union. This cleaving or union is described occasionally by Abulafa in pretty valuable ways. Quote, for now, he is no longer separated from his master, and behold, he is his master, and his master is he. For he is so intimately united with him that he cannot by any means be separated from him, for he is he. Abulafa's depictions of the mystical experiences that can be had while practicing his particular Kabbalah can be very colorful, involving visions of lights, spirit doubles, and other things. In terms of his philosophical language, as we can see from his use of concepts like the active intellect, is essentially directly taken from Maimonides, which is a good example to show that this dichotomy between rationalism and mysticism often becomes quite inaccurate unless we significantly nuance that discussion as well. It can also be interpreted as quite radical in Abulafa's Kabbalah, for he considers the person who had reached this experience of full David the mystical experience, to essentially be prophets. This is something that we also get pretty directly from Herodotus. The highest mystical experience is a prophetic experience, making prophecy in a way the goal of this whole system. This is indeed why it is called prophetic Kabbalah. Abulafa says again, quote, he prophesies according to the entity which causes him to pass from potentiality into the final and perfect actuality, and he become one entity, inseparable during the act. Abulafa was quite controversial too, as you can imagine, and his quote-unquote school, so to say, didn't really survive in any good way, especially not in the Kabbalistic heartlands of Spain and France. Although the ideas of prophetic Kabbalah would survive in places like the Middle East, and they revived occasionally, as well as influencing some significant later developments in Jewish mysticism, which we'll get to. At the same time that Abulafa was active in Spain and Italy, other significant things were happening in the same context, and frankly in connection with it. Namely, the movement where famous and prominent scholars in Spain and southern France who developed quite different kinds of Kabbalah, one that was much more speculative and metaphysically oriented. This early movement is associated with figures like Isaac the Blind in Provence, the circles in Girona and Castile, and major rabbinic and Kabbalistic figures like Rothschild. Taking their cue from early works like the Sefer Hammer here, this led to an absolute explosion of mystical development and speculation. In some ways, all of this culminated in a single work, an absolutely monumental and massive piece of literature entitled the Zohar. I'm sure many of you have heard of this book, and for good reason. It has come to be the main representative of Kabbalah in many ways. It cannot be overstated just how important this book is, with many Jews essentially considering the scripture, especially earlier in history. This book was essentially canonized as part of Jewish scripture for, I would say, most of Jews around the world. The Zohar is a work that kind of defies any simple explanation. It's a massive work, as we said. I think in the recent translation, it comes out, I think, to 12 volumes. text, which is quite significant, right? So it's a very big text, it's a very difficult text, incredibly dense and hard to understand sometimes, but so fascinating and so significantly important for Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in particular. The narrative of the book follows the 2nd century Jewish sage Shimon Rabbi Rothschild as he's strolling with his friends in the hills of Judea. Through the conversations, meetings, and events that occur to them, the book explores all conceivable aspects of Jewish religion, from law and practice to theology and, of course, esoteric Kabbalistic speculation. It is the Zohar that serves as the gold standard for Kabbalah for most of history. There is some disagreement on the whether this work, the traditional account within Judaism and Kabbalah, is that it was actually written by Shimon Rabbi Yochanan himself in the 2nd century, basically secret to all the truth until the late 13th century when it was revealed to the public, so to say. And this isn't the ancient Talmud, albeit a flawed and unusual error, that sort of adds to this image that is some of itself. However, most scholars today are pretty sure that the book was actually composed in the 13th century by the Spanish rabbi and Calvinist Moshe Leon. At least a significant chunk of the book seems to come from the pen of Moshe Leon, but it is possible that the authorship is more diverse, since the book is essentially a collection of infinite, very strange and difficult text, from Bible commentaries to baffling stories. It's really most attributed to Moshe Leon, and he probably wrote at least a significant chunk of the text. It might have been a sort of group project with a group centered around Moshe Leon, who sort of wrote it collectively. We don't know for sure, but certainly it seems to come from this group or this Kabbalistic environment in Castile in particular. It is thus a direct result of the environment in Spain and southern France, and like I said, it represents a kind of culmination of that development, a work that began to define Jewish mysticism further. The kind of Kabbalah that the Zohar comes from and how it defines shape is widely known as the philosophical Kabbalah. So, this Kabbalistic environment this image that is trying to present of itself. However, most scholars today are pretty sure that the work was actually composed in the 13th century by the Spanish rabbi and Calvinist Moshe Leon. At least a significant chunk of the book seems to come from the pen of Moshe Leon, but it is possible that the authorship is more diverse, since the book is essentially a collection of different, very strange and difficult texts, from Bible commentaries to baffling stories. It's even the most attributed to Moshe Leon, and he probably wrote at least a significant chunk of the text. It might have been a sort of project centered around Moshe Leon, who sort of wrote it collectively. We don't know for sure, but certainly it seems to come from this group or this Kabbalistic environment in Castile in particular. It is thus a direct result of the environment in northern Spain and southern France, and like I said, represents a kind of culmination of that development. A work that would come to define Jewish mysticism further. The kind of Kabbalah that the Zohar comes from and that defines shape is widely known as theosophical Kabbalah. And it is this kind of Kabbalah that most of us are familiar with. So, what is it? Well, unlike ecstatic Kabbalah, which is a lot more anthropocentric, concerned with the mystical experience of the individual person, theosophical Kabbalah is more theocentric, concerned primarily with mapping out the divine world, its relationship to this world, and how the everyday Jewish religious practices and commandments, the mitzvot, are connected to the vast divine realities and concepts. The scholar of Jewish mysticism, Moshe Leon, said about theosophical Kabbalah that it encompasses two central subjects: theosophy, a theory of the elaborate structure of the divine world, and the ritualistic and experiential way of relating to the divinity in order to induce a state of harmony. This is a highly theocentric form of religiousness that, while not ignoring the needs of the human being, tends to conceive of religious perfection as instrumental for exerting effective influence on him. And that, quote, the topics dealt with by this law are the nature of the text wrote and the mystical meaning of the commandments. This, I think, captures it very well. Theosophical Kabbalah is an incredibly complex and diverse intellectual tradition that sort of tries to map out the relationship between the divine world, which is represented primarily by the 10 sefirot that we watched earlier, and the human world that we live in, and what the best human response is to that relationship. Although there are, of course, different schools and a diverse array of interpretations and nuances within the tradition, but generally, Theosophical Kabbalah can kind of be defined as being concerned with that topic in particular. So, the relationship between the divine world, the 10 sefirot, relationship within the divine world, between the 10 sefirot, but also the relationship between that divine world and our world, and how the commandments, the mitzvot of the Jewish law, is the way to establish the proper relationship between those two worlds. This is what the Kabbalists and the Kabbalistic literature is primarily concerned with. And many would argue that there is significant influence here from the philosophical school of Greek. But in a way, the issue that the Kabbalists are dealing with is essentially the same as that of the Greek. How do we go from an infinite God, an absolutely eternal, infinite, perfect principle beyond any limitation of conception, to a created world full of limitations and flaws? The Neoplatonists, as you will know, conceived of different hypostases or realities that emanated in steps that eventually became the physical world. From the mind or God comes the use or intellect or mind, after which comes soul, and then we get the sensible world. Even though these realities are interconnected and according to interpretations, they also take place within each other. The Kabbalists had a very similar solution, and were perhaps somewhat influenced by the Neoplatonists. In Kabbalistic terminology, God in his absolute form is referred to with the term Ein Sof. Ein Sof means the infinite, and is a term that denotes the absolutely ineffable divine as it is in itself before self-manifestation. This is a completely transcendent principle beyond the grasp of human reason or understanding. Nothing can be said. This principle is the source, or the creator, you could say, of the phenomenal world. And here we have that problem, right? How does one come from the other? Well, we only have the answer. God emanates God's self, God's light, in stages. And these emanations and stages are the 10 spheres. Each sphere represents a kind of attribute of God as God becomes particularized and in a kind of descending order from top, which is closest to the Ein Sof, to the bottom. The names of the 10 spherot are Keter, being profound, Chochmah, wisdom, Binah, understanding, Chesed, loving kindness, Geburah, power or judgment, Tiferet, beauty, Netzach, triumph or endurance, Hod, majesty, Yesod, foundation, and Malchut, kingdom. That last sphere, Malchut, is very important, not only for being identified with this world, in a sense, with this state before this world, but also for being identified with the Shekhinah. The Shekhinah is indeed another one of the key concepts in Kabbalah and key to understanding the religion of God. The Shekhinah had been a part of Jewish thought for a long time and denoted God's presence in the world. God, as we said, is utterly transcendent and therefore Ein Sof, and according to Judaism, God is also immanent in the world. God interacts with the world, inspires prophets and visions. In Kabbalah, this is how that is explained. The Shekhinah is the last sphere, which is present in the world. And very interestingly, the Shekhinah is understood as being female in nature. In other words, the Shekhinah is the divine feminine, identified as God's presence in the world and identical to the last sphere of Malchut. So this is the divine structure in Theosophical Kabbalah, an infinite divine principle which emanates itself in stages, the sefirot, to create the world, and is present in the world through the feminine side of God, or the Shekhinah. And while there are many different thinkers who have modified details or aspects, this is the basic features of Theosophical Kabbalah, expounded in works like the ViralRabbi. But what does this mean for the human being? How do we interact with this thing? Well, what's the purpose of all this? This is where it gets a little complicated. as it is. Clearly, there is a relationship between the divine world, the Sfirot, and the human world. Some conceive the idea that the attributes of the Sfirot of the mirror can be found in this world, and even that there's a kind of mirror of the 10 Sfirot inside the human being, the macrocosm of the earth. As such, these Sfirot need to be balanced and united within the human person, his mind, actions, and behavior in different ways through religious observances, spiritual practices. In terms of the theosophical Kabbalah, there is a certain theurgic element to it, meaning that we somehow interact and even affect the divine world. Theosophical Kabbalah, as expressed in the Zohar, is primarily concerned on a practical level with the observance of the Jewish commandments in the Bible, the so-called mitzvot. Now, this doesn't just mean the famous 10 commandments that Moses received from Mount Sinai, but all of the Jewish commandments included in the Bible, which make up Jewish law and practice, the Halakha. Kabbalah speculated about the Sfirot in the divine world, but also conceived the importance of the mitzvot in terms of its relationship with the Sfirot. In other words, the deeper mystical meanings and purposes behind Jewish practices like prayer, for instance. A kind of deepening of one's consciousness of the significance of the practice. Now, the idea of the correspondence between the divine and human world also becomes important as the Kabbalists emphasize different ways of unification, or unifying the different spheres within itself and outside itself. This is a complicated idea, but it hints at one of the more radical aspects of the system of Sfirot, the idea that us as human beings can somehow affect the divine world. Now we should remember that God, even so, is perfect and utterly beyond any change or imperfection of Jewish theology. There is still an openness to the idea that our actions affect and interact with the Sfirot in different ways. This becomes perhaps most apparent with developments in the 16th century when there appeared a Kabbalistic circle in the city of Tzfat, or Safed. You can see an explosion of Kabbalistic activity and innovation. These activities are primarily associated with figures in Safed like Moshe Karo, Yosef Karo, Yitzchak Ure, and the student Chaim. Moshe Karo, the first one mentioned, is to my mind one of the most interesting Jewish mystics in history. And it's sad that he's studied for years at Jewish movements. Famous primarily for composing a massive book entitled Holidays with Meal or Orchard of Pomegranates, Karo systematized the teachings of the Zohar and Kabbalah in very impressive ways, while also reincorporating certain aspects of ecstatic Kabbalah associated with Rabbi such as the mystical goal of the Kut or union/cleaving to God, and meditative practices that keep rhythm. And his most widely popular book is probably a book entitled The Torah of Tikkun, The Boundary of Torah, which is essentially a book of ethics that connects to the essential ideas of philosophical Kabbalah. This is an absolutely beautiful book, which at its core explores the idea of imitatio Dei, imitation of God. And this is where it connects to the themes we've been discussing previously. The goal in life is to imitate God by embodying and manifesting the attributes of the divine spirit. This means not only observing the mitzvot from the Jewish law in its particular way, but generally also things like being a kind, loving, and caring person that gives and cares for their fellow beings and creatures. Explaining how to embody the attributes of Keter, he says, quote, no reason whatsoever shall prevent him from doing good to others always in every moment, and no transgressions or misdeeds of unworthy people should stop them from bestowing good on those. And just as God sustains all creatures from the highest to the lowest, despising none of them, but he despised the creatures because of their significance, they will not exist before God. Watching over them and showing compassion to all, so too should God do good to all, not despising any creature. Even the lowliest being should be very important in his eyes, and he should show concern for them, doing good to all who require his goodness. By mirroring and embodying the Spirit through these principles and behaviors, we become more like God. And by becoming more like God, we are connecting ourselves to the divine world and in a way accomplishing God's creation by performing the essence of God's attributes fully, completing its very purpose. We are active participants in the purpose and aim of creation, and play our role fully like continuing their life. This is an idea that stretches back further in history, and Maimonides himself said it's key to ethics. He said, quote, the chief aim of man should be to make himself as far as possible similar to God. That is to say, to make his acts similar to the acts of God. Rivera, of course, takes this a step further by implementing the Kabbalistic ideas of the Sefirot as the key aspect of this teaching of Judaism. Rivera's younger contemporary in South Africa, Rabbi is more famous and influential than history. Passing away at the young age of 38, he had in a short few years absolutely transformed Kabbalah, getting the full most person. When you are talking about Kabbalah and its teachers today, it's usually the so-called Orianic Kabbalah that is taught as Luria's ideas became so influential. And the innovations that Luria made to the system is perhaps the most striking example of the idea that our actions can affect the environment. First of all, Luria is significant for introducing the idea of tzimtzum, or contraction. Remember when we talked about the Sof and how it creates the world by limiting its light to the emanations of this world? Well, there's still the question of how an infinite absolute principle can even become or create something limited in itself. Doesn't that kind of limit the answer by introducing the creation of limits within it? Well, Luria saw this problem by introducing the idea of contraction, or tzimtzum. When the Ein Sof creates or the world, it has to contract from itself to create a kind of void or empty space within its infinite self into which it can pour its light into the vessels of the Sefirot and eventually create the world. This is, of course, a really fascinating and interesting way to solve this issue, which has become very famous and popular since then. If you study Kabbalah again, you've probably heard about this concept of the tzimtzum, a kind of standard way of explaining the equation of the world. This was actually introduced by Luria in the 16th century. Furthermore, in the process of dissemination, something goes wrong. As the Sefirot are created, he imagines them almost as vessels into which the Ein Sof pours his light out. As if you pour water into glass vessels, for instance. But the light of the Ein Sof is so strong and powerful that the vessels can't contain it. As a result, the vessels shatter. And as they shatter, the shards of these vessels descend down into the world. And very significantly, these shards cause more evil in the world. In other words, this is a very unique explanation for the problem of theodicy and the problem of evil. And it is through this that Luria also introduces his strongly participatory Kabbalistic theosophy. What happens when we perform the mitzvot and embody the attributes of this world? When we pray or give to the poor? In a striking way, Luria explains that through these practices we are helping these shards of the broken vessels ascend back into the divine world and gradually heal this world again. In other words, human actions can literally affect, even heal the divine world itself. And by healing the divine, we also heal the world. The famous concept known as tikkun olam, which literally means heal the world. Thus here, philosophical Kabbalah is given a very clear and obvious practical side of purpose. Not only does it explain the divine world and the deeper mystical meanings behind the commandments wanted, it also explains how the performance of those commandments directly participates in the healing of the divine world. In a way, to express it in a radical way, we complete God. And again, this Lurianic Kabbalah, since then, has become the kind of Kabbalah that most of us are taught. This becomes Kabbalah. The ideas of Luria become the way that most philosophical Kabbalists since then understand the system of the Kabbalah works, right? This should not be confused with, it should not be taken to the extreme. We must still remember, of course, that there have been other interpretations, right? Before Luria, even for the Barrow, who was his contemporary at the same Severa, he had a different reading of these things. He interpreted his own art in different ways. Luria was very innovative, it was very unique. And those ideas, in a sense, is not present before him, Kabbalah, and even after him, of course, not every Kabbalist agrees with him. So, before and after, there's a diversity of Kabbalah, right? Even within the so-called philosophical Kabbalah, there are different thinkers, both that then now, that innovate, that see things from different perspectives, that don't agree with Luria and have different interpretations of these things. That should be kept in mind. On top of the fact that things like ecstatic or prophetic Kabbalah has also for the rest of history. And that's also what's significant about this certain Safed with people like Mordecai and Luria, is that they sort of incorporate both the theosophical strands of Kabbalah associated with the Zohar, with the ecstatic teachings and practices of Abulafia, for instance. And this synthesis that happens in Safed is one of the reasons why it's so significant, because this circle in Safed, or there, and especially there, as we see, just completely changes the face of Kabbalah. It really is a very significant. But again, we must point out the fact that there is one Kabbalah, but many different kinds of Kabbalah. There is the philosophical one, which has diversity within it. There is the ecstatic Kabbalah, prophetic Kabbalah, and there are even other forms of Jewish mysticism still happening across the whole history that is neither of these two. There was also, for example, the Pietistic mystical movement in Egypt in the 15th century, headed by Abraham, the father of Maimonides, which took major inspiration from the Islamic Sufis, introduced innovations in prayer practice and prayer, and introduced mystical and ascetic practices, also clearly informed by Sufism. And that is where this group is understood. And the most recent major form of Jewish mysticism is also arguably a unique case, and that is, of course, Hasidism. Appearing in the 18th century, Hasidism has become incredibly popular and in many ways introduced ideas of Jewish mysticism, which were previously the exclusive concern of the elite intellectual elite, to the general masses. To introduce us to Hasidism or Hasidut, there is my friend Rabbi Sevi from the channel Sequels.
Thank you, Philip. Hasidism is a religious revivalist movement which emerged in the mid-18th century in Eastern Europe under the inspiration of Israel the Baal Shem Tov, literally the master of the name. The Baal Shem Tov was orphaned at a young age, and at least according to one version of the narrative, was taken in by a secret brotherhood of Jewish mystics, and under their tutelage developed his own unique form of Jewish mysticism, which placed a heavy emphasis on simplicity and authenticity in the worship of God and service to his fellow. The Baal Shem Tov were going to teach the spirit of life to these students, most notably to Dover the Magid, preacher of resurrection. The Magid, the architect of Hasidism, were going to propagate his Marxist teachings by formalizing and teaching them to a select inner circle of disciples who were going to spread his teachings across his domain, effectively creating a mass movement to spread his master of Baal Shem Tov's teachings, the first of its kind in the history of Jewish mysticism. Throughout Jewish history, mysticism had been shaped into a narrow category of scholars. Hasidism was the first time that teachers and practices of Jewish mysticism reached a sustained mass audience, spreading rapidly across the landscape of Eastern European Jewry. But not without its detractors. With the memory of the devastating failure of the 17-year-old still fresh in their minds, members of the rebellion establishment launched a fierce opposition movement against the young fledgling Islam movement, which culminated in the excommunication of the Islam movement in 1781. This firm opposition had the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of shutting down the movement, it ended up bolstering it and helped cement its folk identity as a spiritual revival of the common folk against the faith. By the time the Magid, historian of Baal Shem Tov, passed away in 1772, 20 or so of his handpicked disciples had been disposed to see the movement all over Eastern Europe and follow the field. Within a few short generations, the Hasidic movement transitioned from a ragtag band of Protestants to a well-established movement of major dynasties, courts, and centers of pilgrimage across Lithuania, like Russia, Ukraine, Valencia, and Poland. With the onset of World War II, the Hasidic world suffered a major blow. The Holocaust eradicated large swaths of the world, tragically wiping out entire dynasties and decimating others. Many historians believe that the history of Hasidism had come to an end. But, following the war, Hasidism picked itself back up from the ashes, rebuilt its communities, and flourished in new lands, both in the United States, Israel, and elsewhere. Hasidism lives on today not merely as a relic of the past, but as a vibrant living force into the future, adding to the rich tapestry of the Jewish world with its unique flavor of religious, spiritual, cultural, liturgical, artistic, and human expression. Part of the challenge of defining Hasidic merit is the sheer diversity of expression and articulation, which emerges even from the very first generation of Hasidism, with each of the earliest masters expressing their own spiritual voice and phrases. Among the early masters, we find those who practiced asceticism, negating the material world, while others preached against asceticism and embraced the divinity hidden within the world. Some advocate for ecstatic communion with God, while others prefer a contemplative approach to divinity. We find some preaching a explicit messianic doctrine, while others negating it. We find some teaching pantheistic and cosmic theologies, while others choose to emphasize God's transcendence and radical otherness. Some are staunch halachists and theorists of Jewish law, while others flirt with doctrinalism. Some highlight the centrality of the Kabbalah and Trinity, while others shun it. And the same goes for Jewish philosophy. Some embrace it deeply, while others outright avoid it. Despite this diversity, there are some common themes which we can try and trace out that might unite Hasidic thought into a cohesive whole, without forgetting the Jewish kingdom. As opposed to the 7th century, that had dominated much practice prior to Hasidism, the Hasidic movement at large placed an emphasis on worshiping God, joy and happiness, song and dance, love and ecstasy. Hasidic thought and practice, as follows, is marked by intoxication, meaning, authenticity, and community. Worshiping God from the Hasidic master is, as it is for many Muslims, seen as an opportunity to approach, be in the presence of, and to perhaps come and unite with the divine. Through the inner work, the avant-garde of Hasidism, particularly the active ritual prayer, the Hasidic mystic strives to strip away the ego, to nullify and integrate itself in an active twin, like a seed which is placed into the dirt, shedding its protective layering, disintegrating into the ground, so that it can be reborn again into the form of a tree. The soul, which implicitly thought is literally the heart of God, likewise needs to strip itself of its shell, and the ego which keeps it trapped into identity, so that it can break down in ecstasy and find itself reborn in God, in what this master's called to. This is the central aim of Hasidism, to unite the true self, the soul, with Trinity in the name of God. This union allows the human to see reality clearly as a manifestation of unity, and to recognize God in all things, not just in moments of sanctioned holiness, but even, particularly, in the ordinary and mundane. This was the messianic realization, and the statement being that the Baal Shem Tov strove to impart to the students. They, to the Jewish masses, are spreading as gospels, teaching women how to unite themselves with God, how to unite with reality. The theology and metaphysics of Hasidism, ViralRabbi attempts to reconcile divine transcendence and goods. They represent a persistent attempt to answer the age-old question of how God can both infinitely incredible love and beyond our reality, and yet deeply invested and present in every moment of it. The Hasidic discourse on this age-old challenge joins a global choir of voices, explicating mystical theologies of the wider meaning, from Plotinus to Bahari, from pseudo-diagnosis to Zero Way. Hasidism picked up the conversation where Kabbalah had left off, dovetailing their cosmological analysis directly into the Kabbalistic discussions of Tzimtzum, divine self-contraction, Shurat HaKelim, cosmic, cataclysmic shadowing, that preceded our present age reality, and the work of the work to recollect and raise the flame sparks of divinity back up to be reintegrated into the source in the fiery aroma of the divine. Parallel to this macrocosmic work of restoring the Nirvana to its original form of glory is the work of the Chesed in themselves, the microcosm, the work to reorient all of its guts, emotional, intellectual, and character traits towards love and kindness, towards God, reintegrating the disparate parts of ourselves back into the true self. There's no doubt that all of these ideas play separate roles in the formation and function of classicism, and perhaps between the parents of all of these doctrines, something of the essence of classicism can be lost. If you'd like to know more about classicism, check out Philip's really video subject. And now, back to you, Phil.
Thank you so much, Sebi, for the beautiful explanation. If you hasn't yet, go check out his channel, Seals of Unity. Subscribe to that channel. It's truly some beautiful content, especially if you're choosing these kind of topics that we're talking about today. Sebi is really guy, so check out his channel. Hasidism is really interesting because it combines many different aspects of Jewish mysticism from over the centuries into a new and fascinating movement. Hasidism is still very popular around the world. While the world of Kabbalah generally was somewhat negatively affected by the reform movements within Judaism in the 18th and 19th century and the rise of more exclusionary rationalism, and of course the very dramatic events of the figure of Shabtai Tzvi, the so-called false Messiah, who in the 17th century convinced most of the Jewish world that he was indeed the Messiah, and then one day converts to Islam. And his sort of claim to be the Messiah is much connected to Kabbalah and mysticism, the reality Kabbalah in particular. That was a huge disaster. And also kind of someone gave Kabbalah their name in certain circles. That certainly helped this process of Kabbalah being less prominent in movements of Judaism today. Works like the Zohar lost its status as scripture to many, and just like in other contexts like the Islamic world, mysticism was increasingly seen as superstitious and detrimental to a pure, rational religion. Hasidism, which was born at the same time, we see a new kind of Jewish mysticism which combines many of the different currents and movements of history and a kind of democratization of mysticism itself. It was no longer just a concern for the intellectual elite, but for everyone. Hasidism is a deeply mystical tradition that has grown immensely popular across the Jewish world today. The 20th century also saw the increased interest in the academic study of Jewish mysticism. And one of the most heated debates regarding Jewish mysticism in modern scholarship has been the question of the mystical union, or the mystical. In the vast world of mysticism, one of the most recurrent themes is indeed this idea of achieving some kind of union with higher realities, and often even the conception of a union with God itself. We find this in Sufism, in Christian mysticism, in Platonism, but does this idea exist in Judaism? Indeed, Judaism puts a great emphasis on the idea of God's transcendence and the clear boundary between God and the created world, so that this is allowed for the enemies. The most prominent scholar of Jewish mysticism in the 20th century, Rabbi Rothschild, argued that it doesn't. To him, and those who followed him, the Jewish mystics, with very rare exceptions, never went as far as saying that there could be any sort of direct union with God. And this was the prevailing idea for a long time, and we found a lot of literature about mysticism in general. But in the last few decades, scholars like Rothschild have gone against this idea, and instead argued that not only does it exist in Jewish mysticism, the idea of the mystical being is a problem. This stance is a very we've seen in this episode many examples of mechanical language. From the earliest writers such as Philo of Alexandria, we find the idea that the human can ascend to God and even unite himself. Philo writes that, quote, he bids them to cleave to him. Out by the use of this word, how constant and continuous and good is the concord of union that comes through making God. In the case of Philo, though, it doesn't seem like a full union with God, but with an aspect of God, namely the Logos. But later in history, we get more clear expressions of the mystical union. perhaps most prominently in the ecstatic Kabbalah and writings of people like Philadelphia, who talk about the goal of daily cult or pleading precisely as a kind of union, where in Philadelphia's words, where he become one entity, inseparable, unite. Slightly later, the fascinating but relatively little-known Kabbalist Rabbi Isaac of Acre wrote about mystical union using the language of water, which definitely mirrors the thought of the viewpoint of Raphael. Quote, she, the soul, will cleave to the divine intellect, and will cleave to her, and she and the intellect become one entity, as if somebody pours out a jug of water into a running well, that all becomes water. This idea further shows up in Safari Kabbalah and also quite prominently in Hasidism, which has a quite upright, monistic, or even pantheistic adjacent theology sometimes, where God is everywhere, and where realizing this unity becomes the foundational figures of early Hasidism. Wrote that, quote, a man must separate himself from any quote things to such an extent that he will ascend through all the worlds and be in union with God until his existence will be annihilated. With all that said, all this of course also comes down to interpretation and how we choose to read some of these passages. And I think with all this in mind, at least to me, it becomes hard to defend kind of hard anti-neo-mystic God in Judaism. I think scholars like Udell and many others, by studying people like this and looking at some of these writings that we explored, have shown clearly enough that the idea of a mystical union with God in some way seems certainly pretty common across the history of Jewish mysticism in different ways. Today, the situation is of course quite complex, as always been. There's been a resurgence of interest in Kabbalah in the last couple of decades, and Kabbalah is taught in various places around the world, sometimes deeply connected to traditional Judaism, sometimes with a more universalist, maybe even New Age connotation. We've seen several celebrities show interest in Kabbalah and bring it to a wider audience, such as perhaps most notably Madonna. At the same time, Hasidism continues to be one of the most prominent movements within Judaism, embodying traditions that are centuries old. In other words, while Jewish mysticism has evolved over the centuries and taken on many different forms, it remains a very significant and important part of one of the most significant and largest religions in the world. Thank you to Zavi and Justin for being part of this video. Really appreciate and always love and honor working together with such talented and beautiful human beings. So go check out their channels, Esoterica and Secrets of Unity. Also, don't forget that I just released my new song, Islas with Zini. If you're interested in the music that I make, which is the music of the majority of the videos on this channel, the music that I make. And I just put out a new song 2 weeks ago, depending on when this comes out. Recently, I've done a new song, so there'll be links to that in the description as well if you're interested. And lastly, of course, I want to extend a special thank you to all the patrons. As I always say, they keep this channel going, and none of this would be possible without you. So thank you from the depths of my heart for all the support. Thank you again to the patrons. Thank you for everyone who likes, who watches, who comments, and who engages with these videos and this wonderful, beautiful community that I'm very proud to be a part of. So thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you next time.
Cool. You are kind of boring, dog. You're fine. Go fuck yourself. When are we gonna start doing it the other way? When I feel like it.